Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream chat. Now, in this essay, I'd like to talk about how the Western media is completely controlled, almost completely controlled by the globalists. Now, depending on how you want to crunch the numbers, somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5% of the media is more or less independent, and the rest of the media, and let's just be generous and say it's even 5% is independent. That means 95% of the media is globalist controlled. So when we look, say, in Australia at clashes between the police and some of the protesters, where the police have behaved in an extremely provocative manner and have tried to single out smaller groups of protesters and slap them around, and where other protesters then come in and there's been a bit of a melee. But the way the media portray it and universally portray it is, in the language they use, the images they use, they're doctoring the images and they're using languages. They're not protesters, they're right-wing extremists. I have heard reports of fascists and Nazis, and just they go on and on with that narrative, and that's blatantly and completely untrue. It's a completely invented narrative. It's a purely propaganda narrative to demonize the protesters. The reverse is the case, though. If it's a climate change protest, whether that becomes violent or not, or a BLM protest, whether that becomes violent or not, then the coverage is completely different. It's a mostly peaceful protest with people who have a justifiable reason to be protesting because they're oppressed and hard done by the wicked, evil white patriarchy, and only evil white Nazi supremacists would disagree, and this sort of thing. So it's clearly propaganda. It's absolute propaganda, full bore. And this is how the media is. So they're so completely controlled. They'll run the same talking points, the same narrative. In fact, they'll even try and outdo each other with the superlatives of, well, I saw 10 Nazis. Yeah, I saw 100. Yeah, I saw 1,000 Nazis. And they'll even go down that path of trying to outdo each other with those sorts of silly things. But it's clearly orchestrated. It's clearly organized. There's a central script that they all read from, and it's obviously a globalist, centrally controlled and orchestrated and stage managed narrative that were being pushed. Now, if I go across different countries, in Australia, for example, if we just look at the mainstream media TV channels, that's not including cable, then in Australia, about at any time, 85% of the viewer population is watching that. Then you've got the sort of cable and associated stuff, so say being on around 15%. And of those, you've got the Twitters and so on that are very, very pro-globalist and very supportive of the globalist narrative, and further the globalist, and shut down people that don't agree with it. Then you're looking at quite small percentage. So if you look at, say, in the United States, you've got things like, parts of Fox News, Tucker Carlson, Hannity, Laura Ingraham, that sort of thing. But they, in the overall scheme of things, their audiences are quite small. But if you look at, say Tucker Carlson, who can be audiences of 3 million or so, and in cable TV terms, that's huge. But really, can such a small segment of the news cycle, such as Tucker Carlson's, as influential as he is, and he is, even he can't really change anything. The body politic, the Democrats, the globalists, they're not frightened of that sort of coverage, that amount of coverage. If they had to face 95% negative coverage, then they'd be different. But they don't. It's only a very small proportion of that. So they're prepared to take the pain on that side, because really 95% of all people looking at a screen or the TV, they're getting the propaganda narrative, and they're getting the narrative that everyone who disagrees with globalization is a fascist, Nazi, white supremacist, and they're getting the narrative that anybody that contributes to the globalization project is virtuous, wonderful, mostly peaceful, and a genuine grievance, and so on and so forth. So really the control there. Now let's contrast this with some years ago, and I particularly remember this one, where the government introduced a new tax on books. It wasn't a heavy tax. I think it was about 2.5 or 5%. It was no big deal either way. And there were a few rumblings about it might discourage people from reading. Is that going to be a good thing? But the narrative or message came out that the government was taxing the Bible. Now, this was some years ago, and there were certainly more people attending church then than there are now. But the public and the media went into overdrive on this. The greedy government taxing the Bible, the Word of God, and so on. And once that came out, the government went into full damage control, panic mode, let alone damage control mode. They went onto every news station they could go on, every current affairs program. They were in complete damage control. Of course, they never meant to tax the Bible. What a misunderstanding. What a mistake. They'd never intended that. Maybe they hadn't been clear enough in their policy paper or policy document or in the proposed legislation, but let me assure you, all the politicians were, this was never going to happen, not at all. And, apologies to the people, and I will write today to make sure that this never happens, and so on. So that was an example of the sort of power the media had to terrify the wits out of politicians and hold them accountable or put the blowtorch to them and that sort of thing. Now, I didn't mean that the media were universal every time. Some sections may support a piece of legislation, one other newspaper or TV channel may not. So there was big diversity within the media itself. Sometimes they would all pretty much all go and chase something, but that was, and that happened, it was rare. But if enough sections of the media were opposed to something, the government would quickly back down, because they knew they'd be castigated and harassed through the media, and that this would have an effect on public opinion. So the globalists were completely right when they were putting all the pieces, building blocks of their power grab together. They knew they had to control the media. Otherwise, millions of illiterate peasants swarming into the United States or into all the Western countries, it never would have worked. The media would have attacked it relentlessly. The politicians would have had to have backed down, and that would have been the globalist project finished dead in its tracks at the time. But instead, the globalists made sure they had the media controlled at first, and so they were able to not only avoid unpleasant optics, avoid any criticism, but they're able to flip the propaganda narrative around so that it's wonderful that all these illiterate peasants are coming in. It's fantastic because they're bringing skill. They're all engineers, they're all doctors, they're all this, they're that. It's wonderful for the country. Everyone's going to be better off. It's a great thing. We've got a shortage of skills. We've got to get these people in, and so they completely change the narrative. To avoid criticism and avoid scrutiny and all these sorts of things that the media typically would do, but also they could flip the narrative and make out that the most terrible, destructive things they were doing, and they are terrible and destructive, are in fact wonderful and good and virtuous and helpful and beneficial and so on. So just to sort of appreciate the magnitude of it, I didn't realise until I crunched the numbers a little while ago exactly how much of the media is globalist controlled. At best, in any Western country, perhaps 5% of the eyeballs on any screen, computer screen or TV screen, are looking at independent media. The rest are looking at globalist controlled media, obviously giving globalist approved messages and talking points and so on. And you can see with the opposition to getting the jab, for example, for the Asian flu, that anyone that opposes it, questions it, has any information that may put it into question, is instantly and immediately attacked by the media universally with the same talking points, the same right-wing extremists, Nazis, fascists. It's the same thing all the time. So we know. We don't need to think or ask. As soon as you see the prime globalist issues of mass control, climate change, race and gender issues, transgender bathrooms, as soon as you see any of that being pushed, you know it's a globalist script. And you know they can only do that because they control the media, and you know that any pushback and so on is going to be minimal because the small amount of non-globalist controlled media that's out there. And you can see sometimes the despair on the faces of the journalists and anchors and so on who are part of the independent media, because they know that no matter what they say, they're only going to influence a very few people, and the globalist controlled media that's helping the globalists completely destroy, crush, and eradicate the West, particularly the white population. They're getting away with it, and nothing so far has been around to stop them. So just consider that when you look at the media, and consider the role and why the Democrats in the US, or any political party in the West, Boris Johnson in Britain, why they're getting away. They're getting away because the globalists control the scrutiny and the criticism that they richly deserve for the way they're destroying their own country, destroying their culture. It's an outrage, but there you go. That's my take on it. You've been listening to Tassus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.